and thank you for joining the latest in our virtual Holding Court series, featuring leading advocates, lawyers, and elected officials to discuss issues related to our courts, our rights, and our justice system. This evening, we are in for a treat. The discussion will be moderated by Guy-Uriel Charles. He is professor of law at Duke University, where he is the co-director of the Law School Center on Law, Race, Politics, and author of over 30 articles. We're so glad to have him on Alliance for Justice's Advisory Council for our Building the Bench program, dedicated to building a pool of demographically and experientially diverse judicial nominees committed to equal justice under law for the next administration to consider. He'll be moderating this evening's discussion. We are honored today to be joined by Amy Klobuchar, Senator from Minnesota and member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Senator Klobuchar has been on the front line fighting Trump judges. And if you did not watch Amy Coney Barrett's hearing last week, you missed her passionate and thoughtful probing questioning at those hearings. Moreover, as ranking member of the Senate Rules Committee, she's been a champion in the fight for our democracy and voting rights. We are also thrilled to be joined by Dale Ho, director of ACLU's Voting Rights Project, where he supervises the ACLU's voting rights litigation nationwide. Among many accomplishments, he successfully challenged the citizenship question on the census in front of the Supreme Court and has been at the forefront of efforts to ensure everyone can safely vote in the middle of a pandemic. And most of all, our Alliance for Justice staff, and led in this effort Holding Court by Keith Tyrion and Daniel Goldberg, we are so glad you could join. To say we are in unprecedented times is certainly an understatement. At Alliance for Justice, in partnership with many of you, we've been in full force fighting mode against Trump and Senate Republicans' efforts to rush Amy Coney Barrett's nomination to fill Justice Ginsburg's seat. We've been mobilizing across the progressive movement, leading the charge in raising the legal community's voice in opposition, including in organizing a lawyer's opposition letter signed by over 6,500 lawyers, working daily with the Hill and sounding the alarm that the next administration and Senate must immediately prioritize undoing this unprecedented attack on our judiciary. This evening's conversation, Democracy Under Attack, cannot be more timely. Republicans are doing all they can to rig our democracy, to keep themselves in charge long after a majority has repudiated them. And key players in this effort are conservative judges. We will have a conversation for approximately 45 minutes and then open it up for questions for the audience. You can submit questions throughout the program by emailing Alicia at afj.org, ALISHA at afj.org, or use the question and answer submission feature on Zoom. And with that, I am so happy to turn this over to Professor Charles.
Thank you so much, Nan. Thank you so much for your great work and the work that AFJ is doing. It is my pleasure this evening to be joined by first my former senator. I used to live in the great state of Minnesota, so to be joined by her, and also one of the nation's leading and smartest civil rights advocates, Dale Ho. So Senator Klobuchar and Mr. Ho, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Oh, thank you. I don't know why you left Minnesota, but we're so glad. Thank you for working. It's an honor to be there, see Nan virtually and all the great work the Alliance is doing, and also Dale, and particularly thank you for your incredible advocacy on the citizenship question to get that out of there. That was there are not that many victories, as you know, before this court and before with this administration, and you got a big one, so thank you.
And just to remind us before we will get going, we will be taking questions from the audience at the end of this program. So if you have any questions, as Nan mentioned, please email Alicia at Alicia, ALISHA at afj.org, or you can just, please email Alicia, that's the best thing to do. We're going to start with Professor Klobuchar, because I know that you
I've been motivated.
as long as you'd like to, you can stay with us forever. This conversation could not be timelier. Not only have millions of Americans already voted, but the election is just 13 days away. At the same time, as Nan mentioned, Senate Republicans are intent on confirming Judge Barrett, someone who will be for decades have a great say in what our Constitution and what our democracy looks like. Now, President Trump has been clear that one of the reasons why he wants Judge Barrett confirmed is to help decide the election in his favor. So I want to just start with that and start with Senator Klobuchar. You sat in the same room with Judge Amy Coney Barrett for 3 days. You had some of the most stunning exchanges with her, including over a federal statute prohibiting voter intimidation. She had difficulty or refused to answer quite critical questions related to our democracy. Based upon your exchanges with Judge Barrett during the hearing, what is your impression on her views on voting rights, and what are some of the things that are on your mind that you'd like to share with us?
Well, first of all, thank you again for doing this. And I did want to welcome everyone watching to the President's Room in the United States Senate. And it's historically where the president would always meet with leaders of Congress. It's right off the Senate floor because I had a vote. So I thought it'd be cool. They have really big chairs in here. And I was telling Dale and Nan about how this was a room where actually when I first started as a brand new senator, Senator Kennedy gathered everyone to work on the immigration bill. So it's a historic place for me because I think of all his good work. And it's a historic moment, of course, in our country's history. It was Hubert Humphrey, the former senator of Minnesota, who once said that if you don't write your own history, other people will write it for you. And to me, that's what this moment is about in terms of the election and voting. And the tragic loss of Justice Ginsburg was made all the more tragic by the decision of these Republican senators to move forward to break their own precedent, which, you know, we're not going to go all over that, and to put forward a nominee that is as far away from Justice Ginsburg philosophically as you could be. And I think I said at the beginning of that hearing, and then I'll move to voting rights here, but one of the things I really feel in my heart is that Justice Ginsburg, when she wrote those dissents, in the words of the rabbi that was did the memorial in the Capitol that I was honored to be part of, the rabbi said that those dissents weren't cries of defeat; they were blueprints for the future. And that's how I think of this whole thing right now. That this election is happening, them plopping this down in the middle of the right in the middle while people are still voting. We have to think of it, those of us out there that want to see a new president and want to see change, as our own blueprint for the future. And one of the ways we can have a blueprint for the future is by protecting the right to vote. And I think you all know that is going on state by state by state right now, including involvement from the Alliance for Justice and ACLU and so many other groups that have been taking on bad laws in states where they have severely tried to suppress the vote, and a lot of that since the Shelby case. And one of the things that is, I want to give you a little hope here, is that we've been winning a lot of those cases. I'm going to go over some that are problematic. We have been winning cases, especially at the state level. We'll get to the federal courts in a second, but we have, and I want to give you that piece of hope. As for the federal decision in Shelby, Justice Ginsburg's dissent is something that was remarkable, of course, for the umbrella line, but also because she specifically said that the Constitution uses the words right to vote in 5 separate places, the 14th, 15th, 19th, 24th, and 26th Amendments. And each of these amendments contains the same broad empowerment of Congress to enact appropriate legislation to enforce the protected right. The implication is unmistakable, and that is that Congress, in her words, holds the lead rein in making the right to vote equally real for all US citizens. Okay, so what happened when we asked the woman who's been nominated to fill Justice Ginsburg's chair that question? So first of all, she did say the right to vote was fundamental, which was better than saying it wasn't. But when you really got to what mattered, and when I asked her about if she agreed with Justice Ginsburg's dissent, she refused to say whether the Constitution empowers Congress to protect the right to vote. She also wouldn't say that mail-in ballots are an important way to vote. That's why I asked. And I thought that was, I also asked if her friends and family had voted that way, and she said they had. And I think it would not be that crazy to say, yes, that's a way you can vote. She wouldn't have to go into cases or anything, but she would not say that. She also wouldn't acknowledge that federal law makes it illegal to intimidate voters at the polls. I asked specifically about the statute. And I thought that was also odd because it wasn't a court decision. It's a statute on the books. So, and then finally, and I think you all know that, she would not commit to recuse herself from election cases this year if she is confirmed. While we have a president that put her name into nomination, who actually sent a tweet saying that he wanted all the justices in place 9, and then at one point more recently said he wanted them on there to count the ballots. So all of that leads to grave concern when it comes to elections. And so that's why I would sort of break it into 3 things. 1, yes, we have concern about what's going on right now, which I'll get to, I hope, at some point. But I do want you to know we're winning a bunch of cases. 2, I'm really concerned about her being on the court because of the cases that will come before them. And then 3, if we win this election big, we will have an opportunity to make some of these changes in Congress. So I wish it was just one straightforward answer. But the one really obviously bad thing out of this is losing Justice Ginsburg and the thought that we would replace her with someone who would not agree to Justice Ginsburg's philosophy when it came to voting.
That is excellent, Senator. So as long as you'll stay with us, I'll come back to you if you'd like. But Dale, I'd like to just bring you into the conversation as one of the nation's leading voting rights litigators. This is likely somebody that you will have to litigate in front of, argue in front of. What are the things that are on your mind? What are the things that you're worried about? What are the types of questions that you're pondering over as you ponder a court with Justice Barrett?
Thanks for that question, Guy. And I just want to say, before I address it, I just want to say thank you to AFJ for putting tonight's event together and for the invitation, and to Senator Klobuchar for those kind words and for being such a champion on voting rights and other civil rights issues. It's really inspiring to see you in action, Senator. The ACLU has 4 cases before the Supreme Court this term. One that I'm working on involving the census. Yet again, it feels like Groundhog Day here, but challenging the president's directive to exclude undocumented immigrants altogether from the census count used to apportion representation in the House. And then also cases among other things, challenging the border wall funding and the Remain in Mexico policy for asylum seekers. These cases were going to be challenging cases to litigate in front of this Supreme Court. And assuming that Justice Barrett gets confirmed, we have our work cut out for us. I will say about the census case, though, the Constitution couldn't be any clearer, particularly for any avowed textualist or originalist. The constitutional command is that the census counts the whole number of persons in each state, and that count is what is used to divvy up seats in the House. And we can talk for, about the different civil rights issues that the ACLU works on and what it'll be like to argue those kinds of cases in front of a new Supreme Court. But on this issue, the census, it's always counted every person in America, regardless of citizenship or immigration status. And I would think that this would be an easy case, even for a conservative jurist, particularly for one who describes themselves as an originalist or a textualist.
Thank you, Dale. Let me remind those who are watching this webinar, if you'd like to join the conversation, if you have questions for our panelists, please send them to Alicia, A-L-I-S-H-A, at afj.org, A-L-I-S-H-A at afj.org. Senator Klobuchar, if I may please bring you back into the conversation. You are a ranking member of the Rules Committee, you are a member of the Judiciary Committee. You have certainly been on the front lines of trying to enact measures designed to protect the right to vote, to strengthen our democracy. And this might be your final remarks with us before you have to leave. So if you might give us a sense of what the future might look like for those who care about our democracy, give us a sense of hope, if you would like to do so. Tell us what you're thinking about going forward and into the future.
Sure. So I'll start with what the challenges are, and I think you know what they are, and that is these court cases that Dale was referring to, and some of them are happening in real time. And we have, as I said, won a number of them, but there are still challenges. And by the way, one we just won 4-4 in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. It just shows, if Amy Coney Barrett, this was a case involving Pennsylvania, which is one of the more complicated states. They're one of the last to count the ballots. And one of the things that I've been working on actually with Bernie is we put out this report, because I'm ranking on the Rules Committee, to show when we're going to find out in different states. Now, if it's really close in any one state, you might not find out right away, but it's going to vary greatly because some states are already counting their ballots. Some states wait until they get their last ballot, and Pennsylvania will be one of the last to count. And so one of the things that the Republican Party did is they tried to stop a decision by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to allow election officials to count mail-in ballots received within 3 days of the election, even if they are not postmarked. And so what happened was that the court denied the Republican request, actually the appeal, on a 4-4 ruling. So you can imagine why Dale and I are so concerned about this nominee and what would happen if it went 5-4. Other examples, I think you've all heard about Texas, where the governor there said they could only have one ballot box per county, and that includes Harris County, which has 4.7 million people, if you can imagine. And this is where you get your mail-in ballot, but maybe you don't want to put it in the mailbox, or you're concerned, and a lot of people feel better about just dropping them off at a ballot box. And so he limited it. A district court judge thoughtfully went through it, rejected that idea under the law, and then 3 Trump-appointed justices came in and reversed it. So there's one example. South Carolina, Republican officials in South Carolina are forcing voters to have a witness sign their ballot, and the Supreme Court recently ruled that was okay during the pandemic, although they did accept some that had not been signed by a witness. So that is the road that we've been on, the hope. And I tell you, there's a lot, and that is that people are voting in droves. They are voting despite this pandemic. We have been united in our focus on telling people they need to vote. In the words of Michelle Obama, to vote like your life depends on it, because it does. 20-some million ballots have already been cast. And there's just some amazing work going on in getting voters the information they need and the safety they need to vote. And this is all, of course, in the wake of a president who's trying to undermine our democracy every single day, with his refusing to endorse this idea of a peaceful transition of power, including on the debate stage, where he has continuously, like several times a day, undermined vote by mail, even though people like Senator Romney has been very clear that he strongly believes in vote by mail. Governors all over the country, Republican governors, by the way, this should give you some hope because a lot of them have blatantly said that they don't agree with him, but he just continues. And of course, the irony is, well, those people in Wisconsin at the beginning of the pandemic, when we didn't know how to keep voters safe when they voted in person, now we know a lot more of how to do that. They stood there outside because of some court rulings, by the way, and a Republican move in Wisconsin from the on Republican appointed judges. They stood there in homemade masks and in garbage bags in the rain, waiting to vote. The Milwaukee Press has estimated that 70 people got the virus simply because they went to vote. Meanwhile, on the other side of the screen was the President of the United States, who at the same time had requested a mail-in ballot from Palm Beach, Florida, and was voting in the luxury of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in his slippers. I don't really know if he was wearing slippers, but that's what I imagine. So that's what's at stake here. And I think the hope that I have, it's not just about voting, it is about healthcare and the case that we have made for allowing people to keep their healthcare while this administration tries to tear it down. The case that we have made for an economy that works for everyone, and the case that we have made that this just cannot be a democracy for Donald Trump. I think I said at the hearing, Donald Trump tries to say this is his country, and especially in states like mine in Minnesota and my neighboring state of Wisconsin, he says it's Trump country. Well, this isn't Trump's country. This is your country. And this shouldn't be Trump's judge. It should be your judge. And the American people are watching and they're voting. And that's what gives me hope. So thanks, Guy.
Thank you, Senator. I mean, we've watched you over the years, and this is yet another demonstration of your brilliance, your passion, your engaged work in our democracy, and we're very thankful for it. So for all of us, and certainly on behalf of those who care about this democracy, I thank you not just for joining us tonight, but for all the wonderful work that you are doing. We support you and we thank you for it.
That's so kind. All right, well, let's get to work. And by the way, remember all the work that we have to do. If everything I want happens with the Senate and with the presidency, you know, our work actually just begins because there's so many things we have to do to protect the First Amendment, to make sure that we do police reform, to do something when it comes to, of course, getting through this pandemic and healthcare. So for me, it'll just be beginning, but I want to thank you for looking out for our democracy like you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. So Dale, let me now turn to you. This year, more than ever, voters are being forced to choose between their safety and their ability to participate in our democracy, from waiting in long lines, potentially exposing themselves to COVID. Senator Klobuchar just mentioned the Wisconsin experience, to the Trump administration threatening to send military forces to the polls, to DHS warning that polls could be flashpoints for potential violence. So how should we and how can we combat this? One could think of it as this new voter suppression and educate voters about how to cast their ballots in this environment.
There are so many challenges in this environment. I think even without the pandemic, this would have been a really, really challenging environment with the country as polarized as it is, with events like Kenosha, self-declared militia going around in places with, you know, assault rifles openly, and the tragic events there, Portland, and unidentified federal agents intimidating and escalating violence. It's already a really challenging environment, and then you layer the pandemic on top of all of this. Poll worker shortages, more than half of poll workers over the age of 60 typically, polling place closures. It's likely that we will have more voters assigned per polling location than at any election in American history. So what can we do? The first thing I think is flatten the curve, right? It's the first thing that we were told when the pandemic hit. Got to make life easier, or easier isn't the right word, but we've got to try to make it as easy as possible for healthcare providers to deal with the surge of patients coming in, but we got to do the same thing for elections administrators and the surge of ballots. And the good news is it looks like people have gotten that message. 37 million people have already voted in this election. Compared to 2016, we had about 14 million ballots cast at this point. So we're like at more than 2.5 times the number of ballots cast. People are getting the message that if we have a flood of ballots coming in at the last minute, that means you potentially overwhelming the counting machinery for absentee ballots. If we have a flood of voters coming in on election day, that could result in the kinds of long lines that we saw in the primaries in places like Milwaukee and Atlanta and Las Vegas, 7-hour lines in Vegas, and delayed results, which threaten to undermine public confidence in the results and potentially result in confusion and opportunities to sow chaos. So that's the thing that every voter can do. We've done what we can at the ACLU to try to facilitate that. We've sued a number of states, 25 lawsuits in all we've filed since the pandemic to try to make voting easier, to open up opportunities for people to vote before election day, whether that's by mail or in person in early voting. Those cases have had mixed success, and I'm sure we're going to talk about some of the reasons why that's the case and the balance of the judiciary. But beyond the litigation, we're also trying to make sure that everyone knows the rules for voting early, whether by mail or by in person. One of the big challenges in educating voters about these opportunities is our decentralized election system with 50 different rules for who can vote by mail, whether or not you have to request a ballot. If you do, the deadline and the process for doing that, and the deadline for returning it. And then if you can vote early in person, how many locations there are in your county, that varies by state dramatically. What the hours are, what the days are for voting early in person. So the ACLU's created a website, aclu.org/voter. That's aclu.org/voter, which has a 50-state guide to all of the pre-election day voting opportunities there are in person or by mail, so that people can navigate that system, make a voting plan. Don't just wait till the last minute. Figure out how you want to vote. Encourage your family and friends to do the exact same thing. You can use our webpage as a guide if you need information on how to vote early by mail or in person. That's the first thing that everyone can do. Second thing, if people want to do more than that, there's a poll worker shortage, massive poll worker shortage right now, which is going to make it harder for people to vote on election day. Obviously, a lot of people can't volunteer to be a poll worker right now with the pandemic going on, particularly if you're older or if you have a pre-existing condition. But if you're young and you're healthy and you're willing to do it, jurisdictions on states all throughout the country need more poll workers. The ACLU of Georgia, for example, has been doing a lot of poll worker recruitment among young and healthy people so that we don't have the kinds of shortages that we had that led to insanely long lines during the primary. We're seeing long lines during early voting. Part of that is because people are trying to flatten the curve. That's a good thing. But we want to do what we can to help elections administrators have the capacity they need to process what is going to be a really, really, really high volume of demand for voting because of the high levels of voter interest this year.
Yeah, this is great. So I'm going to ask you a question about how you all choose which cases to file in this area, but I want to just underscore some of the points that you made so that people understand why we have some of the issues that we have in our democracy. You know this very well, but maybe many of our participants don't know it quite as well. We have a system for federal elections that are basically run by the states. The states provide the substantive rules and they run the democratic process. And it's decentralized, as Dale said. So what that means is instead of having a national system, right? So, think of the fact that we have like the Department of Homeland Security that tries to deal with a whole bunch of national security questions at the centralized level. Well, we don't have that for voting. What we have is a very decentralized system in which the rules differ from state to state, and the practices differ not just from state to state, but even within states, between counties and cities and precincts and localities. So one of the great things that the ACLU has done by providing information so that way voters can know, because there's no central mechanism, there are few central mechanisms by which you can gather information and just to know, hey, what in the world is going on? How do I find out where, what the rules are, where I am? Yes, you might be able to go to your state website, but at least having that information in a centralized way. So that's wonderful. Now, the other thing that you all are doing too is you are litigating, that is, you're dealing with the gaps and the problems in the system by identifying the types of laws that make it harder for people to vote. So I want to ask, how do you do that? And then we could talk about what are some of the results and why those results are. But just from an outset, how do you all decide where you're going to litigate? What are the rules that need to be challenged? How do you decide to make those types of decisions?
When we try to look at what kinds of barriers to voting we think are the most significant, both in terms of the number of voters that are being affected, but also in terms of equity issues. Are voters that historically have been the target of disenfranchisement schemes, are they suffering disproportionately from particular measures? And in particular, I'm thinking about voters of color, Black and brown voters, young voters, low-income voters. Are the restrictions that we're looking at, do they disproportionately hit voters in those groups? And if so, that raises, I think, special concerns if you really care about democracy and equal access and making sure that all communities and individuals are represented equally. Now, how do we translate that into action? It's tough because not everything that is the most suppressive in terms of turnout or the most racially discriminatory in terms of the disparate impact is amenable to litigation. Not every problem is litigable. And when we think about what's litigable, we inevitably have to think about the makeup of the courts, right? We have to think about whether or not the kind of claim that we want to bring, whether it's the legal theory or just the sort of equities of the claim, when you look at the facts. If we think that the court in that area, whether it's a state court or the circuit, or ultimately the Supreme Court, if we think it's the kind of case that might end up there, if this is the kind of claim that they're going to be open to, and that obviously changes depending upon the composition of the judiciary. I'll say this here, in particular, with the pandemic hitting, we were a little more aggressive than we might normally be in terms of targeting voting practices that in normal circumstances might not seem like a big problem to a lot of people. They maybe cause some number of ballots not to be cast or not to be counted, but are generally viewed as pretty reasonable regulations. There are a number of restrictions like those that in the context of a pandemic just have a completely different character. So whether it's limitations on eligibility to vote by mail, Tennessee, for example, took the position that if you could physically travel to a polling place, you could not vote by mail in that state. You had to vote in person. So we brought a lawsuit on behalf of a two-time cancer survivor who was immunocompromised and whose wife is also immunocompromised, arguing that in the conditions of the pandemic, there is a constitutional right for him to vote by mail because that's the only way to protect his health and not have to choose between protecting his health and exercising the franchise. 16 states normally require some kind of excuse in order to vote by mail, and we thought that that was a problem with the pandemic going on. Other states have requirements to have someone witness your vote by mail ballot, you completing it, and to actually sign the envelope of your ballot, or even to have that ballot ballot envelope notarized by a notary public. Again, that's something that under normal circumstances, maybe it's not that big of a deal. It probably stops some number of people from voting or some number of ballots from being tossed. But in the pandemic, when more people are voting by mail and when that requirement forces people to break social distancing protocols that we're all being asked to observe to keep ourselves, our families, and our communities safe, well, that just takes on a different character. And I think we had no choice but to try to challenge that. And we did in 8 states. After the primaries, we saw that in Wisconsin, the absence of a witness signature was the #1 reason for absentee ballots being discarded. in April. So, we look at the number of voters affected, we look at the circumstances that might be surrounding a particular election. Here it's the pandemic, and then we of course have to think about our likelihood of success, and that means looking at the bench.
So we're going to talk a second about looking at the bench, but the first thing we might want to do is also help our attendees understand the legal framework, right? So there is no, especially for the context of presidential elections, there's no federal right to vote. As people know, we're dealing with the Electoral College, and so there isn't even, technically a federal right at all. Voting for presidential elections all depend upon the state. So can you talk to us a little bit about how the legal framework impacts the type of voting problems that we see, as well as how it influences the types of, how you bring the case, what types of cases that you bring, how you challenge barriers to voting as a consequence of our legal framework?
It's very difficult because there isn't an express affirmative grant of a right to vote in the United States Constitution. That's in contrast to virtually every state constitution, which has either an express enumerated right to vote or some sort of provision about having free and fair elections or something like that, which has been interpreted as an affirmative grant of a right to vote. The Constitution mentions the right to vote in many places, as Senator Klobuchar noted, but it's almost always prohibitory, things that states can't do with respect to the right to vote, rather than things that states must do. So the 15th Amendment, you may not discriminate on the basis of race in allocating the right to vote. The 19th Amendment, same for sex. Poll taxes, same thing, may not impose them, may not restrict voting on the basis of age, right? These are all prohibitions on what states can't do, but not affirmative statements about what states must do in order to protect a right. And that makes our job,
right?
I'm sorry?
In contrast to the First Amendment, where the Constitution provides, that you have an affirmative right to speech, as an example.
Yes, exactly. It just makes our job a little bit harder, I think, in court. Now, the Supreme Court has held that there are constitutional limits with respect to what states can do in terms of regulating the fundamental right to vote. Most of those cases came up in the context of candidate and party access to the ballot, and not in the context of individual voters seeking to exercise the franchise. So that the constitutional doctrine, I guess I'd say, around the right to vote has sort of developed over time, and it's not a perfectly apt tool sometimes for the kinds of voter suppression or other restrictions on voting, problematic restrictions on voting that we encounter and seek to litigate against.
This is great, Dale. A reminder to our audience, if you have any questions, which we'll turn to audience questions, Alicia, please send them to Alicia, ALISHA @afj.org, ALISHA@afj.org. Now let's turn to the composition of the court, or the judiciary, and how that impacts both litigation strategy, cases that you win and lose. We seem to have a divide in this country between those who want to make voting easier and those who think that there's a problem of voter fraud, between those who want to strictly enforce and interpret certain types of positive laws, and then those who want to take much more of an equitable approach. So if you would mind talking to us about how the judiciary and the composition of the court, the composition of the courts themselves impact the types of cases that you win or lose, and how that factors into voting suppression issues.
I mean, just like with any kind of issue, and that extends beyond public interest and social justice and civil rights issues and voting rights issues specifically, practitioners can tell you that different courts are receptive to different kinds of arguments or sympathetic to different kinds of parties. And that's something that we're always thinking about when we're considering litigation on voting rights. What's the track record of the state bench in a state where we're thinking about litigating, or in the circuit where we're thinking about litigating? Now, I would say that I'd say that I would hope that protecting the right to vote would be something that jurists across the ideological spectrum would be interested in, right? The sort of, I mean, both in kind of, broad kind of philosophical terms and like commitment to democracy, but also, in jurisprudential terms too. The whole sort of, I think, basis for being skeptical of judicial review of positive law, right? Of statutes, of regulations on various forms of human activity, but particularly in terms of voting. The reason to be skeptical is, we don't necessarily want courts, imposing their own policy judgments over the majority as expressed through the actions of the legislature. But voting rights are in some ways a different issue, because if you have a situation where a restriction on voting, or a redistricting scheme, or something else, something that regulates the voting process, credibly prevents the will of the majority from translating itself into policy enacted by a legislature, then the reason to be skeptical of the judiciary's role starts to fade a little bit, right? That is, when it comes to restrictions on the democratic process itself, which in some cases may call into question the legitimacy of supposedly democratic outcomes, there is a strong role for the judiciary to play in terms of making sure that the process of our democracy is itself free and open and fair. I would hope that that would be something that, an argument that jurists across the ideological spectrum would be open to. And in egregious cases, historically, with a lot of our cases, we have met with success in front of judges appointed by presidents of both parties. The case that I sort of think of as the nearest and dearest to my heart in my career was a case in Kansas challenging a requirement that people show a birth certificate or a passport when you register to vote, something that almost no one carries with them, and which many people have a difficult time either locating or affording. We got that law struck down in front of a district court judge appointed by George W. Bush, and that ruling was affirmed twice, both at the preliminary injunction level and then after trial, in an opinion in the 10th Circuit authored by Jerome Holmes, who himself was a George W. Bush appointee. In extreme cases, we can meet success with judges across the ideological spectrum, but I will say that that may be changing, right? The kinds of people that the current president has appointed to the bench take a very hard line view on a lot of the issues that we litigate. And, while there have been some notable successes like that Senator Klobuchar pointed to this year in terms of voting rights litigation, there have been a lot of failures too. And, the New York Times just 5 days ago came out with an article describing a study of appellate court decisions in voting rights cases this year. And I think the stat was more than 80% of opinions authored by judges appointed by Republican presidents made it harder to vote, as compared to about 34% of appellate court decisions authored by judges appointed by Democratic presidents. Now, broad sweeping terms, you can't, there are a lot of differences. It's hard to control for those differences in cases. And like I said, I do think in our best cases with judges appointed by previous Republican presidents, we've had a lot of success. But the courts today are harder places for voting rights than they were, I would say, even 10 years ago. The Pennsylvania, case that went to the Supreme Court recently, which was, I think Senator Klobuchar described it as a win. It was a win for voters who postmark their ballots by election day in Pennsylvania will have them counted. But it was a very disturbing way that we got there. That was a decision by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court under Pennsylvania law, with the Pennsylvania Supreme Court saying that the Pennsylvania affirmative grant of a right to vote protects voters whose ballots are postmarked by Election Day. The RNC and the Trump campaign sought a stay of that ruling in the United States Supreme Court, and 4 justices on that court indicated they would have granted that stay, even though there isn't a real federal question, raised by that claim. Now, I know that the RNC and the Trump campaign concocted one, but it is a pretty remarkable argument that I think a few years ago would not have been taken seriously by, say, many of your colleagues in academia, Guy, but now appears to have some purchase amongst almost half of the current Supreme Court.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a wonderful point. I want to follow up on that, but I want to take up a question from the audience first. So the question is, this is a unique election year, but I'm not sure I understand what the role of judges in a traditional election cycle and how that role has changed this year. Could you explain that to me? So, so for our audience, let's try to explain how in a traditional election cycle, how we deal with voting issues, and then particularly then in this context, right? You talked about the fact that you all challenged some laws that you wouldn't ordinarily have challenged, but you think that COVID in some senses bolstered the legal argument, especially when we're talking about the balancing of burdens and benefits. So can you talk a little bit about that for the benefit of our audience members?
Sure. Litigation around voting rights and election issues has been increasing substantially over the last 2 decades, I'd say. Bush v. Gore was kind of one inflection point, and litigation over election rules in the wake of Bush versus Gore. And then I would say another inflection point hit after the 2008 election. Prior to 2008, there was largely an elite consensus in this country amongst policymakers that voting should be getting easier, more accessible to everyone. Not that there weren't disagreements about how fast or how far we should go, but at least general agreements over the directionality that voting rights should be moving in. You think about the 2002 Help America Vote Act, passed bipartisan support and signed into law by George W. Bush. The 2006 Voting Rights Act reauthorization, passed 98-0 in the Senate, also signed into law by George W. Bush. But it's only after Barack Obama gets elected and we have kind of record levels of turnout by particular segments of the electorate, voters of color making up a bigger percentage of the electorate than ever, young voters turning out at higher levels than ever, that you suddenly see this pushback and a wave of laws that make it harder for people to either register to vote or cast a ballot. And that's triggered another sort of inflection, I would say, in the rate of increase of election-related litigation. Courts are called upon to adjudicate these disputes sometimes in the months or even weeks before an election, and have increasingly been called upon to do so. And I'd say if you compare presidential year over presidential year and midterm year over midterm year, for the last 10 years, it's gone up every election. This cycle, I would say, is different just in terms of the frequency and intensity of those fights and the number of disputes that the courts are being asked to adjudicate. And that's part of the direction that we were going in already as a country. Part of it is the response to the pandemic and the fact that there are some restrictions that, because of the public health conditions that we're facing right now, just take on a different kind of character. And part of it is also, I think, just the intense polarization that the Trump years have brought on, including, I would say, unfounded fears or even outright lies about threats to election integrity and things like fraud. So courts are being asked to do more than ever. And I think in response to that, a judge-made doctrine known as sometimes the Purcell principle that has been used to stay relief ordered in voting rights cases if an election is near has expanded dramatically and made it harder for plaintiffs in voting rights cases who obtain wins at the trial level to maintain those wins in the context of emergency appeals in the shadow of an election.
Great. So there's another question. I want to put that on the table, so here's a question. Because of the increase of mail-in voting and delays in vote counts, we might not know who wins the election on election night. Can you talk us through the possible scenarios that happen that night and what we need to be prepared for?
Sure. So that is a very, very, I think, important concern that people need to be aware of. I think people are increasingly aware of it, and the media is getting the word out. There are so many more ballots being cast by mail in this election than
here's a scenario. Let me paint this for you. Many election analysts have said that Pennsylvania might be the tipping state. We know that there are a lot of mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania, and we know that they're not going to start counting those ballots until election evening, I believe. So here's a scenario. Let's assume that it's a close election, comes down to Pennsylvania, go Dale Ho.
Yeah. So 3 factors create this situation. Unprecedented numbers of votes cast by mail. This is Pennsylvania's first presidential election with no excuse absentee voting, plus you have the pandemic. 2, Pennsylvania has a law that prohibits the processing of ballots until election night after polls close. That means they can't even verify that the information on the outside of the envelope is accurate and complete and compare the signatures until polls close, let alone actually begin the process of tabulating, which is the 3rd factor, tabulating the absentee ballots. Just the mechanics of that take longer than counting in-person votes because you got to unfold them and then feed them into a machine. If Pennsylvania is the decisive state, we may not know who the president-elect is on election night. And that is a big shift. Americans have gotten used to polls closing and then 30 seconds later, breaking news graphics on CNN or Fox News or MSNBC telling you a forecast of who won the state. We may not have that.
If I may add one more factor.
Oh, yeah.
Brilliant consideration. Let's also now assume that there's a partisan split between the election day voters and the vote by mail voters. So what does that mean, by the way, that there's a partisan split?
So I've seen, a number of polls showing that there are big partisan differences in intended vote method this year, right? Perhaps that reflects the partisanization of levels of concern about the pandemic. Mm-hmm. But in essence, in many states, amongst voters who plan on voting by mail, Biden is the preferred candidate by a very wide margin, whereas amongst people who plan on voting in person, Trump is the preferred candidate by a much smaller margin. But if you map that onto Pennsylvania, you could have a situation where on election night, half or more of the ballots have not been counted yet because they're absentee. Those ballots we anticipate based on public opinion polling will be heavily Democratic. But the in-person votes are tallied on election night, and they show that Trump is the winner, or winning, I should say.
And what do you think the president will do if he is shown that he is the winner on election night?
Well, he has said that mail-in ballots are fraudulent, right? So he's kind of laid the groundwork for a narrative where he's actually won the election at that point. And that can undermine the American public's confidence in the integrity of the result as the absentee ballots are counted. That is a potential opportunity to sow confusion or chaos. It may even give rise to efforts both politically or legally to disqualify swaths of absentee ballots. Now, I'm not aware of any plans to do that. That would be a direct frontal assault on democracy as we know it. But it's not the last 9 months feel like a series of things that I thought would never happen happening every 2 or 3 weeks. So we just want to be prepared for anything. Now, it's possible none of this will happen, I should say, right? It's possible that We will know the winner of the presidential race on election night because a number of states do process their ballots on a rolling basis. Florida is one. Georgia starts doing it a few weeks before the election. Arizona is another. So is North Carolina. So, if there's a wide margin of victory, or Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin are not decisive, we may know the winner on election night. And that everyone would, I think, breathe a sigh of relief. But if the 3 states that were decisive in 2016 are the pivotal states this year, we could very well end up in a situation where we don't know the winner on election night because all 3 states do not permit the processing of ballots until either election day or, in Michigan's case, the day before election day. And it'll be days or even a week before we get a final vote count in those states. And that creates a lot of opportunities, I think, for malfeasance.
We have about a minute left. So I'm going to ask you to, what are your parting thoughts? Again, the nation's really foremost litigator, you have a bird's eye view on these types of questions. What are the thoughts that you'd like to leave us with?
I guess what I'd say is, in spite of all of the dire scenarios that people are gaming out and thinking about, so far, so good so far, right? Like I said, almost 40 million people have already cast their ballots. There are unprecedented levels of voter engagement, and people are obviously thinking ahead about how to vote. My hope is that means that people have gotten the message to flatten the curve, to not wait until the last minute. Hopefully that will reduce the kinds of problems that we will see on election day in terms of crowding at the polls. When it comes to the Postal Service, a lot of concerns about that, but let's remember that the Postal Service, delivers over 100 million packages a day in the week leading up to Christmas, right? We're not going to have more than 100 million people voting by mail. The capacity is there for the Postal Service to handle things. Now, we're getting closer to Election Day, and people may want to start thinking, people who were planning on voting by mail but haven't taken any steps to do that yet, you might want to start thinking about different ways of doing things, like voting early in person, right? Or maybe hand delivering your mail-in vote if that's something that your state permits at a drop box, and that's a convenient opportunity. But the Postal Service, generally speaking, has the capacity to handle what is going to be demanded of it in this election. Elections administrators around the country have been working very, very hard over the last few months. There will inevitably be issues, as there are in every election, but the system can handle it. Voting rights litigators like myself are working through the Election Protection Program operated through the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights around the country. It's a network that has a 1-800 number, 866-OUR-VOTE. That's 866-OUR-VOTE for anyone who encounters problems on election day, to talk people through those problems, or make the phone calls that are necessary to resolve them, or bring the emergency litigation that's needed. We will be there to respond to problems as they emerge on election day, and fingers crossed, we will get through this like we have every other election in our nation's history.
Dale, you're brilliant as advertised. I want to thank Aaron True, Keith Therian, and of course, Nan Aron of AFJ. Thank you for this wonderful conversation. Support the places that support democracy. And it really is up to all of us to maintain this wonderful democracy. Go out and vote and help other people vote. All have a great evening, and thank you so much for joining us. And thanks again, Dale.
Thank you so much. It's great to see you, Guy.
Wonderful to see you. Goodbye, everybody.